Mr. Vice President, the entire narrative you have presented to the American public is a carefully constructed illusion, Representative Ilhan Omar stated, leaning deliberately into her microphone, her voice carrying a sharp edge of profound scrutiny. The Senate Commerce Committee chamber was filled to absolute capacity, with every designated press seat occupied and camera lenses from every major broadcasting network lining the perimeter walls. This gathering was originally scheduled as a standard routine hearing focused on the intricacies of international trade and domestic immigration policy, but the representative clearly harbored a fundamentally different agenda. She had been meticulously orchestrating this precise confrontation for the better part of 3 weeks. Holding up a visibly worn copy of his renowned memoir, she allowed it to drop onto the wooden dais with a calculated sense of dismissiveness. "It is a beautifully woven tale, Mr. Vice President," she continued. "A compelling saga of economic percent, hardship, personal struggles, a resilient grandmother who guided your path, an Ivy League legal education, and the ultimate realization of the American dream. It is undeniably moving." She allowed a heavy silence to settle over the room, letting the theatrical pause do its intended work. "Except you authored those pages from the comfort of San Francisco, while employed by a highly exclusive venture capital firm, generating substantial wealth from individuals who have never once set foot in the Appalachian region and who likely never will." Vice President J.D. Vance remained seated in the presiding chair, his facial expression projecting a mask of absolute neutrality. He made a singular quiet notation on the yellow legal pad resting before him. He offered no interruption, sensing that his counterpart was merely laying the foundation of her critique. "You frequently speak of traditional working-class values, Mr. Vice President, yet a prominent Silicon Valley investor contributed $15 million to fuel your senatorial campaign," she pressed on. "You speak eloquently about self-reliance and pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, yet that Ivy League institution provided you with a golden ticket into the upper echelons of the elite. You advocate for the overlooked citizens of the industrial heartland, all while accumulating tens of millions in financial backing from tech billionaires who view those very regions as mere flyover country." She leaned forward, narrowing her focus. "And then you sit before us today as Vice President, serving an administration led by a figure you once privately likened to history's darkest, authoritarian dictators. Those were your exact sentiments, transmitted in a private digital message to your own college roommate, questioning whether he was merely a cynical political operator or something far more dangerous. Where do your core principles reside, Mr. Vice President? Where is your fundamental integrity? Where is the genuine individual who supposedly emerged from modest beginnings to achieve greatness strictly through earnest labor and unwavering honesty?" She leaned back in her leather chair, projecting a quiet sense of satisfaction. "I will tell this committee where that individual is. He is an invention. Your public persona is a theatrical performance, a meticulously designed mythology, intended to make you appear relatable to everyday working families. While you actively serve the interests of the ultra-wealthy, you do not represent the authentic voice of the heartland. You are simply their most lucrative export to the elite donor class." The atmosphere within the chamber was practically electric. Sympathetic members of the committee offered subtle nods of agreement, while the public gallery murmured with collective anticipation. This was the exact crescendo the ETSI representative had been building toward. The passionate progressive standard-bearer, challenging the populist-turned-executive on a globally televised broadcast. The vice president slowly placed his pen down onto the desk for the very first time since her opening remarks began. He directed his gaze straight toward her. "Have you concluded your statement?" "Representative." His voice resonated through the sound system, remarkably calm and almost gentle in its cadence. There was an absence of defensive posturing, an utter lack of visible anger. It was delivered simply as a procedural inquiry. The representative appeared momentarily destabilized by this profound lack of reaction. She had fully anticipated that he would interject, that he would attempt to vigorously defend his character, thereby providing her with further rhetorical ammunition. Instead, he had simply sat there and absorbed it. "I assure you, I have significantly more to express regarding your record," she countered. "I am quite certain that you do," the vice president replied, casually reaching for a thick manila folder positioned beside his chair. "However, I have a brief series of questions for you first, if you will indulge me." She cast a fleeting glance toward the committee chairman before returning her attention to the witness table. This specific hearing was convened to discuss vital matters of immigration and trade policy, not to "You have dedicated the past 18 minutes to launching a comprehensive critique of my personal character, my family background, my financial history, and my life's trajectory." His tone remained perfectly level and unwavering. "Believe I am afforded the basic parliamentary courtesy of a response." He opened the folder with deliberate slowness. "Let us thoroughly examine the concept of the American dream. Representative, let us discuss the true nature of authenticity, the burden of integrity, and the question of who is truly exploiting their personal narrative." He lifted his eyes, meeting hers across the expanse of the legislative chamber. "Let us talk about your record." 2 hours prior to this exchange, the representative had confidently strode into the Senate building, projecting an aura of absolute ownership. Her legislative team flanked her on all sides, carrying dense binders filled with opposition. Research she had long since committed to memory, she had practiced every vocal inflection, every dramatic pause, and every devastating historical quote sourced from her opponent's past. This was designed to be her defining hour, the moment she would publicly deconstruct the executive's carefully curated image. Before a national audience, the hearing's official mandate was to explore diverse political perspectives on the national dream, and she had been brought forward as an expert, witness ostensibly to recount her compelling journey as a refugee who ascended to the halls of Congress. The invitation had been strategically arranged by the minority coalition, eager to place her narrative at the forefront of the day's media cycle, but she had arrived with a distinctly different objective. For 3 relentless weeks, her communications and research staff had compiled a mountain of material: his shifting political allegiances, his prominent coastal benefactors, his elite academic credentials, the criticisms of his literature as mere poverty tourism, his controversial private messages, and his polarizing public statements regarding family structures. They had gathered every necessary component to dismantle his public standing. She had meticulously rehearsed this confrontation before mirrors, before her trusted advisors, and before sympathetic media contacts who had privately assured her they would aggressively distribute the resulting footage. Anticipated headlines were practically already written, destined to dominate the evening broadcasts and cement her legacy as an uncompromising political warrior. What she did not comprehend, and what she could not have possibly foreseen, was that the vice president had been actively preparing for this specific encounter for significantly longer than she had 6 weeks prior. When the schedule was initially circulated, his chief of staff had correctly identified her probable line of attack. It was not a particularly difficult strategy to forecast, as she had successfully utilized variations of this method in previous settings. The planned public ambush, the rehearsed display of righteous indignation, the viral moment, precision engineered to circulate across social platforms long before any independent observers could verify the underlying context. Upon receiving the briefing, the vice president had listened intently and offered a simple directive. "Excellent. Let her proceed." His communications director had expressed immediate concern. "Sir, she is preparing to strike at your most vulnerable political vulnerabilities. We need robust defensive talking points prepared immediately." Had simply shaken his head. "No, we need to allow her to construct her entire rhetorical argument without interruption. Do not engage, do not defend. Let her articulate every critique she wishes to make, because every single accusation she levels at me is going to serve as a mirror." He had then produced a folder of his own, the culmination of 6 weeks of exhaustive, quiet investigation. She will critique my shifting political alliances, I will acknowledge them, and then inquire about hers, the allies she has discarded, and the platforms she has abandoned. When they ceased to be politically expedient, she will scrutinize my financial backing. I will accept it, and then inquire about her own wealth disclosures, and the glaring disparities between her official filings and her public fundraising rhetoric. She will question my dedication to working-class citizens. I will concede the point and then ask her to justify her 7-year tenure in the legislature and what tangible progress she has genuinely secured for the vulnerable constituents who elected her. He had softly closed the folder on his desk. Every weapon she deploys against me, she is ultimately deploying against herself. The defining difference today will be that I am fully prepared to answer her inquiries. She will find herself entirely unable to answer mine. His analytical team had spent the ensuing weeks operating in absolute silence. They had extracted nonpartisan legislative tracking data, federal election filings, mandatory financial disclosures, and historical floor voting records. They had acquired archived, unedited broadcast footage. They had meticulously cross-referenced every single assertion against primary undeniable source materials. By the dawn of the hearing, he possessed 4 distinct files, arranged with mathematical precision: the narrative, the finances, the legislative output, and the behavioral pattern. He knew with absolute certainty what she was going to say, and he knew precisely how the remainder of the morning would unfold. As she had approached the witness table with visible confidence, he had simply watched her. She had not so much as glanced in his direction. She was completely absorbed in her own mental preparations, silently running through her rehearsed dialogue. She remained entirely oblivious to the reality that she was voluntarily walking into a remarkably sophisticated trap of her own design. Her opening offensive had been undeniably thorough, methodical, and verbally devastating. For 18 uninterrupted minutes, she had commanded the room. She had labeled him an opportunistic shapeshifter, a political chameleon, and an opro-juzzatoo's instrument of the billionaire class. She had aggressively highlighted his elite credentials, masquerading as rural authenticity. The sympathetic members of the committee had visibly relished the display. The journalists in the gallery had been typing with furious speed, already framing the narrative of a political titan being brought to heel. That very enthusiasm should have served as her initial warning sign. He had absorbed the entirety of the barrage without uttering a single syllable in his own defense. Now the vice president was opening the first of his manila folders, and a palpable shift in his physical demeanor took place. The passive, accommodating listener vanished. Replacing him was a figure of sharp, focused, and deeply patient authority. Representative, he began his voice, maintaining its composed resonance. You have leveled several highly serious allegations regarding my character, my family history, and my personal integrity. I genuinely appreciate you outlining them. With such clarity, it makes my next steps considerably more straightforward. He extracted a single piece of paper. You have formally accused me of promoting a fraudulent life story, of manufacturing a relatable identity strictly for political and financial gain. So let us engage in a candid discussion about manufactured narratives. Representative, let us examine the vast delta between the heroic stories a public figure tells and the actual paper trail they leave in their wake. He looked up from the document. Since you initiated the topic of finances, let us begin there. He retrieved a formally stamped document and placed it squarely on the surface of the desk, ensuring the various camera angles could capture its official seal. Representative, in early 2025, your mandatory congressional financial disclosure was released to the public domain. It officially documented a personal net worth ranging between $6 million and $30 million. It is understood that these disclosures operate within broad brackets, but the absolute minimum floor of that legal declaration was $6 million. He allowed the sheer weight of that figure to echo in the silent chamber. During the exact same week that this official document became public knowledge, you authored a post on your social tool-argin media platform, I possess a printed preservation of that statement right here. He elevated a clear visual screenshot. You wrote, and I am quoting your words verbatim, I am barely worth thousands, let alone millions. He gently set the paper back down. You did not claim you were worth less than people assumed. You did not suggest that financial metrics are complex. You stated, barely worth thousands. Those are your chosen words, standing in direct contrast to a legal document. You expected, submitted, and signed under the strict penalty of perjury. The representative's voice remained highly controlled. Congressional financial disclosures are highly complex administrative instruments. They often encompass, they certainly are, he agreed seamlessly. However, your social media statement was quite the opposite of complex, barely worth thousands. Was that a factually accurate statement? Representative, as I was explaining, the disclosure reflects a broad spectrum. I am not inquiring about the broad spectrum of the disclosure, he interjected softly, reality to your supporters. A simple yes or no will suffice. A heavy silence descended upon the room. The vice president calmly made a notation on his pad. I will note for the official committee record that the witness has declined to confirm the accuracy of her public statement. He set his pen down. But it is not the numerical value that truly interests me. It is the underlying narrative. He leaned slightly closer to the microphone. You have meticulously constructed your entire political identity upon the foundation of being an marginalized outsider, a refugee who arrived with nothing, a champion who fights relentlessly for the underprivileged against the entrenched wealthy class. You have raised extraordinary sums of money utilizing that exact narrative you have secured. Your electoral victories, based on that story. It is the absolute bedrock of your public existence. He held up the digital screenshot in one hand and the legal financial disclosure in the other. When your legal filing indicated a minimum of $6 million, and your immediate public defense was to claim you were barely worth thousands, what you effectively did was weaponize your own compelling history as a protective shield against basic transparency. You utilized the refugee narrative to obscure the reality of the numbers. He placed both papers down simultaneously. You stood here, today, and accused me of exploiting my personal history for profit. I ask you now, what is the appropriate terminology for a public official who leverages their inspiring life story simply to avoid answering a direct, factual question regarding their own vast wealth? She opened her mouth to respond, but he had already moved to the second folder. Let us transition to your next critique. You forcefully attacked my legislative effectiveness, Representative. You strongly implied that I offer rhetoric to working-class citizens without delivering tangible results. That is a fair standard of measurement. Let us examine the respective records. He produced a professionally bound report. This data is sourced directly from an independent, nonpartisan legislative tracking organization. You have held your seat in the House of Representatives for 7 consecutive years. During that extensive tenure, according to their objective data, exactly 3 of your sponsored bills have been signed into law. He raised 3 fingers in the air. Item 1. Legislation designating a postal facility in your home district as the Martin Sabo Post Office. A ceremonial naming passed via a standard voice vote. He slowly lowered his index finger. Item 2. Legislation designating another postal facility in your district as the Charles Lindbergh Post Office. A second ceremonial naming. He lowered his middle finger. Item 3. A piece of legislation providing federal funding for emergency school meals during a global health crisis. I will state unequivocally that this was a genuine, impactful achievement. It provided sustenance to countless vulnerable children. I say that without a trace of irony. It rightfully deserves profound acknowledgement. He lowered his hand completely. However, 2 ceremonial post office designations and a single emergency meal program that represents the entirety of the statutory legislative record for a federal official who has spent 7 years aggressively positioning herself as the essential leading progressive voice in American politics regarding foreign policy, comprehensive immigration reform, and systemic economic justice. He rested the report on the desk. Furthermore, you were formally removed from your assignment on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Several years ago, the very committee that holds direct jurisdiction over the international matters you speak about with the greatest volume, you have not been subsequently reinstated. He looked at her with a steady, unblinking gaze. You accused me of serving elite interests rather than everyday people. I present this question to you. When the citizens of your district sent you to the Capitol 7 years ago, when working-class families and new immigrant communities cast their ballots for you, genuinely believing you possessed the capability to deliver systemic change, what did they actually receive in return? He held up his hand once more. 2 post offices, 1 meal initiative, and the loss of a vital committee seat. Her jaw visibly tightened. The true measure of a representative's legislative impact cannot be solely quantified by, I am quite familiar with the defense. He nodded with practiced patience, moving the parameters of the debate, shifting the societal Overton window, building grassroots movements. I have heard the arguments, and I concede that some elements of that defense hold merit. He gracefully picked up the purchased next folder. But here is the fundamental question that your constituents deserve to have answered. When you stand at high-dollar fundraising events and promise your donors that you are fighting the systemic battles on their behalf, and when you look your community in the eye and promise them you are in Washington to alter the fabric of society, are you openly discussing the 2 post office namings? Are you highlighting the committee assignment you lost, or are you simply selling them? Whichever version of the narrative guarantees the highest financial yield. The Grand Chamber had grown uncomfortably quiet. You accused me of manufacturing a false narrative. I invite you to tell me in this historic room, on this official record, while the cameras broadcast live. What exact narrative have you been selling to your financial backers that your actual legislative history fails to support? The representative gripped the edges of the table, her tone hardening significantly. I believe the dynamics of what is occurring in this room are blindingly obvious to any fair-minded observer watching at home. She purposefully directed her gaze away from the vice president and directly into the red lights of the broadcast cameras. The Vice President of the United States did not arrive at this hearing to engage in a substantive debate regarding immigration policy. He arrived to execute calculated, coordinated political takedown against a woman of color, a religious minority, and a former refugee who has possessed the courage to demand answers from the entrenched power structures of this nation. She paused to let the gravity of her framing take hold. This is the standard, operational playbook. When a woman with my background who looks the way I do and prays the way I do becomes too prominent, too vocal, and too undeniably effective, they secure a room filled with cameras and attempt to systematically dismantle her reputation with selective paperwork and highly sanitized prepared attacks. She rotated her focus back to the dais. If you wish to scrutinize attendance and records, let us examine yours, Mr. Vice President. You were entirely absent for 22% of all Senate roll call votes during your initial 2 years in office. That represents the absolute poorest attendance metric of any sitting senator. During that legislative session, you failed to appear for over 150 critical votes. She delivered the statistics flawlessly. This was the terrain she had prepared to fight on. You speak grandly about delivering for the working class, yet you were far too preoccupied with securing a promotion to the executive branch to actually cast a vote on their behalf. You championed the forgotten citizens of the industrial heartland. Yet you could not be troubled to show up and legislate on the very bills that govern their daily lives. She opened her hands wide. And you presume to lecture me on the subject of legislative dedication. He listened to the entirety of her counteroffensive without a single physical flinch. You are factually correct. Those 4 words effectively brought the oxygen in the room to a standstill. I was absent for 22% of those scheduled votes. He continued smoothly. That is a matter of documented public record I was actively engaged in, a national executive campaign, and that significant undertaking directly impacted my daily legislative attendance. I have addressed this reality publicly on numerous occasions. It is not a secret. He offered this admission without a hint of defensive spin or political deflection. Then, his eyes locked onto hers once more. The critical difference between us in this moment, Representative, is that I just answered your aggressive inquiry directly. I confirmed the fact. Without hesitation, he slowly opened the 3rd folder. I have posed 3 distinct questions to you thus far. I asked about the accuracy of your financial statements. I asked about the tangible results of your legislative record. I asked about the disparity between your fundraising rhetoric and your actual accomplishments. He raised 3 fingers, repeating the earlier gesture, but this time imbued with an entirely different psychological weight. You have failed to answer a single one of those inquiries, directly. Not one. At every given opportunity, you have pivoted the discussion toward broader societal issues, toward your personal identity, toward the presence of the media, and toward vague accusations regarding what powerful IT do 12 stup, a validated Indra stup. He lowered his hand to the desk. I intend to try this exercise one more time. I am going to ask you about a specific public statement you made several years ago in Los Angeles at a high-profile fundraising banquet for a civil rights organization. He required no notes to recite the quotation. You stated, and I want to ensure my phrasing is exact. This organization was founded after the events of September 11th because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. He placed the printed transcript onto the table. There are two profound factual discrepancies within that single sentence, he noted, holding up his index finger. First, the organization in question was officially founded in 1994, a full 7 years prior to the Temina quote. Events of September 11th. That is an indisputable historical fact, easily verifiable. In a matter of seconds, he raised his middle finger to join the first. Second, some people did something. He allowed a heavy, respectful pause to fill the room. When he resumed speaking, his cadence had slowed deliberately. I would like to read a few names into the official congressional record. Welles Crowther. He was 24 years of age. He was employed on the upper floors of the South Tower. His family was only able to positively identify his actions that day through recovered footage of his trademark red bandana, a gift from his father. He dedicated the final hour of his life to guiding disoriented survivors down 18 flights of smoke-filled stairs before the structural collapse occurred. His remains were eventually recovered alongside 3 emergency responders he was actively attempting to assist. The chamber was completely silent. Betty Ong. She was a senior flight attendant aboard American Airlines Flight 11. She courageously remained on an open communication line for 23 minutes, following the breach of the cockpit, calmly relaying vital intelligence to ground control personnel data that later proved essential to understanding the mechanics of the tragedy. She was fully aware of her impending fate, yet she maintained her composure and held the line. The vice president looked directly across the room at the witness. Those are merely 2 of the nearly 3,000 innocent individuals whose lives were violently extinguished that morning. They were not simply some people, and the atrocity inflicted upon them was not merely something. They were the victims of a highly coordinated, deliberately planned act of international terrorism orchestrated over a period of years. He let the immense gravity of the history settle over the proceedings. I completely recognize the context of your address. You were speaking to an audience deeply concerned with civil rights. The subsequent rise in discrimination against certain American communities following those attacks was a genuine, serious, and deeply tragic reality. You were attempting to articulate a broader point regarding the fragility of constitutional liberties. I comprehend that context entirely. However, you are a sworn member of the United States Congress. You represent an entire constituency of the American Republic. And you consciously selected the phrasing, "Some people did something" in a public forum on the permanent historical record to characterize the most devastating attack on domestic soil in our modern history. He leveled a steady gaze at her. What exactly would you say to the father of Welles Crowther if he were seated in this gallery watching this proceeding today? The representative drew a deep, steadying breath. She proceeded to deliver a passionate and highly articulate response concerning the very real dangers of domestic phobias, the overreach of domestic surveillance initiatives, and the post-center, profound trauma experienced by marginalized communities who found themselves unjustly targeted in the chaotic aftermath of global tragedies. It was a deeply substantive answer, addressing a very real societal failing delivered with evident, genuine emotion. He listened carefully to every single syllable. That is a very serious and thoughtful response regarding a deeply serious societal issue. He acknowledged quietly, I do not dismiss the validity of your concerns. However, you once again did not answer the specific question I posed, inquired as to what you would say directly to that young man's grieving father, and I inquired regarding two highly specific, easily provable factual errors contained within one single sentence of your speech, the founding date of the organization and the shockingly dismissive terminology you utilized to describe the architects of a mass casualty event. I am simply asking you to reconcile those two specific elements using your own words. That is the entirety of my inquiry. She glanced quickly toward the cameras and then toward her silent colleagues seated nearby. I have addressed this specific controversy quite extensively in various public statements in the past. You certainly have, he replied evenly, but you are refusing to do so here, today, directly to this committee. He methodically picked up the final folder from the stack. I have one final area of inquiry to explore. Several years ago, the House of Representatives held a formal vote on a resolution designed to officially recognize a historical genocide, the systematic eradication of an estimated 1.5 million ethnic minorities by the Ottoman Empire. During the early 20th century, he presented the official voting tally sheet. The final result was overwhelming. Over 400 affirmative votes, a handful of dissenting votes, and exactly one member voting present. That singular present vote belonged to you. He placed the paper gently onto the wood. Your formal justification at the time was that the annotation hesitates. Official recognition of historical atrocities should not be utilized as a blunt political instrument, and that any such resolution should theoretically be expanded to encompass a multitude of other historical tragedies. I have reviewed your academic reasoning, and it represents a coherent, if debated, ideological stance. He paused, letting the context solidify. However, in the 18 months directly following that specific vote, you proactively utilized that exact same term genocide to describe the ongoing geopolitical conflict in the Middle East no fewer than 11 separate times across your public statements, official press releases, and social media channels. 11 distinct times. You attached no complex historical conditions. You made no demands for the simultaneous recognition of other global tragedies. You simply applied the explosive terminology directly and repeatedly. He leaned slightly forward, his voice a study in measured curiosity. I am simply trying to understand the underlying consistency of your principles. Representative. When over 1 million individuals were systematically eradicated over an 8-year period, the application of the term required complex academic conditions and a broader historical context before you would offer your signature. Yet, when you desired to formulate a harsh political critique regarding contemporary American foreign policy, that exact same term was readily available for your use. Without hesitation, 11 consecutive times. Is that a deeply held moral principle? Or is it merely a flexible rhetorical weapon deployed only when it serves your immediate partisan objectives and securely holstered when it does not? She immediately launched into a highly technical defense regarding international humanitarian law, the complexities of urban warfare, the plight of civilian populations in conflict zones, and the nuanced differences between recognizing historical events versus addressing active ongoing military operations. She was operating on incredibly familiar political terrain here. This was a debate she had engaged in countless times across cable news networks, and she argued her perspective with well-rehearsed fluency. He waited patiently for her to finish. I am not asking you to defend your broader geopolitical stance on the conflict, he clarified softly. I am asking you to explain the highly selective application of a specific word. The identical terminology applied to wildly different historical scenarios, utilizing two entirely different ethical standards. He slowly began to gather his various documents, tapping their edges against the desk to align them perfectly. You came to this chamber today and accused me of being a political shapeshifter. You accused me of tailoring my messaging to appease different audiences and of performing a pantomime of authenticity, while living a fundamentally different reality behind closed doors. He looked at her with a piercing directness. I have openly acknowledged my past electoral calculations. I have openly admitted to my poor attendance record. I have answered your hostile inquiries with direct confirmations. In return, I have presented you with questions regarding your financial integrity, your meager legislative output, your historically inaccurate characterizations, and your selective morality regarding international atrocities. 4. Exceptionally specific, heavily documented, fact-based inquiries. He held up 4 fingers. You have not answered a single one of them with a direct response. Not one. The silence within the massive chamber had transformed into something physically heavy. So, I am going to attempt a slightly different approach, he said, pushing the neatly stacked folders entirely to the side of his desk. I will not ask you about a specific legislative vote or an archived social media post or a financial document. I am going to ask you a simple, direct, human question, just from me to you in the quiet of this room. He steepled his fingers. When you stand before your loyal financial donors and assure them you are battling the establishment on their behalf, when you look into the eyes of working-class immigrant families in your home district, promise them that you are the singular force capable of bringing change to Washington? Do you actually believe it? Do you genuinely believe your own manufactured narrative with the same fervor that you demand they believe it? That was the precise moment the foundation finally began to fracture. It did not occur instantaneously. The representative was far too seasoned a political veteran, far too meticulously disciplined to completely unravel at the first sign of genuine pressure. She had successfully navigated legislative battles and public scandals that would have permanently derailed the careers of lesser politicians. She had occupied seats in hostile hearing rooms far more aggressive than this one, and emerged largely unscathed. She possessed a formidable emotional armor, forged over a grueling 7-year career of absorbing intense public criticism and magically converting that negative energy into highly lucrative political capital. She managed to maintain her composure for roughly 30 more seconds. She utilized that time to launch into an impassioned defense of her years of dedicated service, the immense personal sacrifices she had endured, the marginalized communities she championed, and the profound symbolic importance of occupying the very seat she currently held. But the vice president simply refused to interrupt her. He merely sat there and waited. And there was something profoundly destabilizing about that specific type of waiting. The calm, thoroughly documented, entirely undefensive stillness of a man who held all the cards. It proved far more devastating than any aggressive cross-examination ever could have been. She had extensively prepared to face a brutal offensive. She was ready for raised voices, for gavel-banging interruptions, for the theatrical aggression that she could easily judo flip into a viral fundraising moment, showcasing her victimhood and bravery. She had utterly failed to prepare for a powerful adversary who would simply sit in polite silence and wait indefinitely for her to answer a direct question she desperately wished to avoid. You want to lecture me about believing my own public narrative. The tone of her voice had grown noticeably sharper, shedding the polished veneer she had maintained for the initial 20 minutes. The carefully rehearsed cadence was beginning to fray at the edges, revealing the raw tension shifting furiously beneath the surface. You want to preach to this committee about political authenticity. You privately labeled the leader of your party a dangerous, historical, authoritarian, and then you publicly groveled for a position on his presidential ticket. You methodically scrubbed every trace of your critical social media history before launching your senatorial campaign. You happily accepted $15 million from a Silicon Valley oligarch and then immediately went on national television to champion the cause of dismantling the billionaire class. She was leaning heavily into the microphone now, projecting the exact same aggressive posture she utilized during her most fiery speeches on the House floor. You have the audacity to ask if I believe my own story. At the very least, my personal story did not require me to digitally erase my entire public conscience before I sought higher office. You are factually correct. The vice president stated, marking the third time. That morning he had offered immediate confirmation without a trace of defensiveness. I deleted those digital posts. I drastically altered my political posture. Regarding the administration, I accepted that financial backing, every single element of your critique, is fully documented and widely acknowledged. I have discussed those compromises publicly on the permanent record on multiple occasions. He observed her with an expression that conveyed neither hostility nor pity, but rather an analytical precision that suggested he had mapped out this entire conversation long before she had ever stepped foot into the building. But, Representative, I am still waiting for my answers. 4 straightforward questions. You have yet to answer one of them directly. I have already addressed the financial statement, she countered defensively. I asked if it was an accurate statement. A 3-word answer would suffice. I have provided the necessary context regarding the complexities of the legislative record, he interrupted softly. What are you selling your donors that your actual record fails to support? That is a bad faith characterization of 7 years of exhaustive advocacy. The founding date of the civil rights organization. The some people did something. Phrasing. What exactly would you say to the grieving father of Wells Crowther? I have repeatedly addressed the broader societal context of that specific address in numerous public, the historical tragedy in Armenia. He pressed his voice, never rising in volume. Is the application of the word genocide an unwavering moral principle, or merely a convenient rhetorical tool? Silence. It was a markedly different variety of silence than the ones that had previously blanketed the room. The earlier silences had been the natural pauses of an audience processing complex information, waiting in suspense for the next rhetorical blow. This new silence was thick with sudden realization. It was the collective silence of millions of viewers simultaneously recognizing the vast, undeniable chasm between a direct question asked and an answer actively avoided, and performing that political calculus in real time. 4 distinct inquiries, 4 elaborate deflections masquerading as responses, and over 14 million citizens watching the evasion unfold live. And then the representative committed an error she had successfully avoided throughout 7 grueling years of hostile media interviews, combative legislative debates, and relentless public scrutiny. She exhibited a reaction that all abiding her sophisticated media training and hard-won survival instincts had failed to suppress. Because while a seasoned politician can expertly navigate partisan ambushes, manufactured outrage, and the standard theater of political warfare, it is nearly impossible to permanently deflect a deeply patient opponent who simply asks the same irrefutable question 4 times and refuses to let the clock expire. She lost her temper. It was not the highly calibrated performative frustration she routinely manufactured for the evening news clips, the righteous managed indignation designed to generate lucrative fundraising emails within the hour. She was an absolute master of that specific tool. This was something fundamentally different. This was the authentic, unvarnished anger that simmers violently beneath the polished performance. It was the profound frustration of a combatant who had entered the arena carrying every available weapon, perfectly rehearsed, every line of attack, successfully executed every contingency plan, and suddenly realized that none of it had made a single dent. The attacks had failed, not because they were inaccurate. Her critiques regarding his past statements, his wealthy benefactors, his elite credentials were all entirely valid. They had failed because he had immediately conceded to all of them, neutralizing their power, and then calmly trapped her in a corner, using her own documented history. Do you want to know what this truly is? Her voice was low, tight, and barely clinging to its professional restraint. The edge of raw fury was unmistakable. Now, this is exactly what powerful men attempt to do when they wish to permanently silence a woman who dares to ask uncomfortable questions of the establishment. They arrive armed with meticulously curated folders. They weaponize bureaucratic documents. They cynically invoke the names of tragic victims from decades past. And they hold those names up like protective shields because they are fundamentally incapable of defending the horrific policies they are currently inflicting upon marginalized communities. Communities exactly like mine. Immigrants, refugees, and every anti-too vulnerable individual who arrived on these shores believing in the promise of a fair system. Representative the Vice President's voice was remarkably even quieter and more measured than before. I have answered every single aggressive question you have posed to me today with a direct confirmation. When you are asked simple, factual inquiries on the official congressional record, you respond by delivering pre-written, highly defensive talking points. Was your financial statement factually accurate? It is a binary question. The federal financial disclosure process is vastly more complicated than a simplistic binary. She paused, looking sharply toward the Vice President. She then glanced at the impassive lenses of the broadcast cameras and finally toward the row of allied committee members seated beside her, who were all quite noticeably staring intently at the wood grain of their desks, actively avoiding her gaze. She looked back at the Vice President, who remained seated in a posture of absolute unyielding patience, wearing the exact same expression he had held since the hearing began. And in that singular, agonizing moment in the crushing silence that immediately followed her third consecutive refusal to answer a three-word question, in those compressed, terrible seconds where 14 million voters were watching her actively dodge accountability, the dam finally broke. She said it. She did not shout it. She did not deliver it with the booming force of a campaign rally. She uttered it almost quietly, almost as if she were speaking only to herself, utilizing the exhausted tone of someone who has been forcefully suppressing a profound resentment for an agonizingly long time, finally lacks the energy to contain it any longer. You people always do this. The grand chamber did not erupt into chaos. Instead, it plunged into an absolute freezing stillness. It was not the stillness of an audience shocked into temporary paralysis. It was the chilling stillness of an audience that has just witnessed a fatal political miscalculation and is collectively holding its breath as the ramifications settle. You people. She had not said, you members of the opposing party. She had not said, you entrenched politicians. She had not said, you members of this specific executive administration. She had bypassed the dozens of standard acceptable political formulations that could easily be contextualized. explained away by friendly media surrogates, or smoothly walked back in a carefully drafted press release later that afternoon. You people. Two incredibly loaded words, broadcast on live national television. Unfiltered, unedited, and permanently recorded on a split-screen layout, beaming directly into 14 million living rooms. The digital clips were already rendering, the juxtaposition of her uttering those words, followed by the vice president's stoic expression, followed by the deafening silence of the room. The defining media moment had already been permanently forged. By the time the chairman struck the gavel to adjourn, those two words would possess an unstoppable momentum, entirely divorced from the broader policy context of the hearing. The vice president held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. He did not offer a victorious smile. He did not press for further clarification. He simply turned his head toward the committee chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have no further inquiries for this witness. The hearing was formally adjourned 17 minutes later, concluding with the quiet finality of a heavy vault door sealing shut. The representative delivered a highly composed, clearly hastily written closing statement, emphasizing the vital importance of focusing on substantive policy over base personal attacks. She formally thanked the committee for their time, gathered her thick binders, and exited the chamber, surrounded by a protective wall of staff members. She kept her posture rigid, her chin elevated. She was a hardened survivor. She had endured explicit threats to her safety, aggressive removals from powerful committees, and hostile crowds, demanding her deportation. She was still upright. She always remained upright. But 14 million citizens had just watched two highly revealing words slip past her legendary discipline. And those two words were already accelerating toward becoming the sole defining memory of the entire spectacle. The vice president lingered in the chamber for a dozen minutes, following the adjournment, politely exchanging pleasantries with the nonpartisan committee staff and briefly reviewing the initial transcripts. His communications director approached him quietly, holding out a digital tablet, displaying the rapidly escalating social media analytics. The phrase, "you people," had already captured the #1 trending position in 44 states. He glanced briefly at the glowing screen, then handed the device back. Ensure that formal floral arrangements are sent to the family of Betty Ong, he instructed quietly. And to the Crowther family as well. He gathered his 4 manila folders and calmly departed the room. The initial defensive maneuver from the representative's political apparatus arrived shortly before midnight. It was an urgent, aggressive fundraising communication bearing the subject line, "They attempted to silence me today. Stand with our movement." The email successfully generated over $2 million in a matter of hours. The sympathetic progressive media outlets immediately deployed the defensive narratives they had pre-written days in advance. Representative holds firm during hostile interrogation, and vice president's political ambush falls spectacularly flat. The predetermined framing was aggressively pushed out to the public, adjusted only slightly to account for the actual events of the day. However, by the time the sun rose over the Midwest the following morning, the unedited video clip containing the phrase, "you people," had amassed over 60 million independent views across various digital platforms. It wasn't the debate over the financial disclosure that went viral. It wasn't the nuance of the international treaty votes, or the sparse legislative record, or the refusal to answer the 4 specific questions. 2 words: live television. 60 million views before breakfast. The fundraising team had successfully generated $2 million. The unedited footage had captured 60 million sets of eyes. Anyone possessing a rudimentary understanding of modern political mathematics clearly understood the devastating disparity between those two metrics. 3 days later, the major metropolitan newspaper in her home district published a highly anticipated editorial. It was remarkably cautious, desperately attempting to appear fair-minded. It was precisely the variety of editorial, crafted by an institutional board struggling to convey a deeply critical message without appearing overtly hostile. The piece rightfully acknowledged her long history of passionate advocacy and the undeniable hostility she routinely faced in the national arena. It conceded that the hearing had likely been orchestrated as a partisan trap, and then in the final paragraphs it posed a profound question. When the vice president presented the representative with 4 highly specific inquiries regarding her own documented public statements and her official legislative record, she repeatedly declined to provide a direct answer. We do not begrudge her the right to vigorously defend herself against what was clearly an adversarial line of questioning. However, we must suggest that the hard-working citizens of her district, the diverse working families who have placed their ultimate trust in her representation for nearly a decade, are fundamentally entitled to direct answers regarding her record. If not in a hostile congressional setting, then somewhere at some point in her own unfiltered words, the editorial board, pointedly, refused to print the phrase, "You people they did not have," too. The implication resonated powerfully enough without it. Exactly 1 week following the disastrous hearing, a highly respected independent polling firm released a flash survey regarding voter sentiment within her district. The primary question posed to the electorate was remarkably straightforward. Do you believe your representative accurately and honestly represents her personal record and ethical background to her constituents? Prior to the hearing, the affirmative response had sat comfortably at 63%. 1 week after the hearing, the affirmative response plummeted to 41%, a catastrophic 22-point collapse in a mere 7 days. This devastating shift did not occur because the progressive voters in her deeply blue district had suddenly experienced a profound ideological awakening and embraced the vice president's conservative platform. It occurred because an incredibly simple, entirely fair question had been asked 4 consecutive times on a massive public stage, and the politician they trusted had blatantly refused to answer it. The voters who had proudly provisions with a dozen purses displayed her campaign signs on their lawns. The families who had pointed to her ascension as proof of the American dream to their children had watched her evade basic accountability in real time. Inside her bustling district campaign headquarters, a senior strategic advisor silently slid the devastating polling report across the center of a large conference table. 4 elite political operatives sat in the room, absorbing the grim mathematics. No one dared to speak for several long minutes. Finally, one advisor broke the silence, their voice barely above a whisper. The filing deadline for the primary election is 11 months away. No one offered a response. Her district had always been considered the ultimate political fortress, a geographic stronghold where a primary challenge was previously unthinkable. The ground was visibly shifting. During the subsequent weeks, 3 highly subtle shifts occurred that the national political media apparatus largely failed to detect. The first was a quiet, intimate conversation taking place inside a modest coffee shop in the heart of Minneapolis. 2 middle-aged women, both of whom had tirelessly volunteered for the representative's inaugural congressional campaign, sat across from one another. They had spent countless weekends knocking on doors in freezing weather. They had personally chauffeured elderly voters to polling stations. They had wept tears of absolute joy on election night, feeling as though the victory belonged to them personally. As they sipped their coffee, they did not discuss the vice president's politics. They discussed the phrase, "you people." They debated what it truly signified and whether it possessed the underlying animus. It seemed to project. One woman finally sighed. It probably wasn't meant the way it sounded on television. Her companion nodded, slowly swirling her cup. Probably not. But the lingering hesitation in her voice spoke volumes. Neither of them was completely certain anymore. The second subtle shift occurred within a private invite-only digital networking group, exclusively for young professional immigrants in the metropolitan area. A localized post appeared, written in a native dialect, asking a remarkably pointed question. When she looked at the cameras and said, "You people," who exactly was she referring to? And more importantly, who are we to her now? The post rapidly accumulated hundreds of intense, deeply conflicted comments, while many quickly rushed to her defense. A significant portion of the community lingered on the uncomfortable question, suggesting a quiet, growing unease that had been steadily metastasizing since the broadcast. The third, and perhaps most politically dangerous shift, was a private telephone conversation between the representative and a highly influential local city council member, a man who had aggressively endorsed her candidacy in every single election cycle since her political inception. The tense call lasted slightly over 20 minutes. While the council member wisely refrained from publicly broadcasting the details of their discussion, his posture shifted dramatically. Mere days later, when, cornered by a local political reporter regarding his willingness to formally endorse her. In the upcoming increasingly competitive primary cycle, he offered a meticulously crafted, devastatingly neutral statement. "I firmly believe that the voters of this great district deserve a highly robust, open conversation regarding their federal representation and the tangible realities of their legislative record. That kind of competitive dialogue is ultimately healthy for our democracy. That is not the statement of a loyal political ally. That is the carefully calculated rhetoric of an ambitious local leader, preparing to quietly sever ties before the ship begins to take on water." 5 years after that fateful morning in the Commerce Committee chamber, an acclaimed independent documentary filmmaker released a definitive feature-length retrospective examining the cultural impact of the confrontation. The film, appropriately titled 4 Questions, featured extensive, unfiltered interviews with key strategic personnel from both political camps, deep-dive analysis from renowned behavioral scientists, and previously unreleased behind-the-scenes footage captured during the intense preparation phases leading up to the clash. The documentary prominently featured the vice president's methodical preparation process. It showcased the neat chronological arrangement of the manila folders, his legal team exhaustively verifying the provenance of every document, and the executive himself appearing remarkably calm and singularly focused. The cameras captured him, addressing his senior staff late the night before the hearing. Let her articulate every single attack she wishes to make. He was recorded saying, leaning against a conference table, "Do not interrupt her flow. Do not prepare defensive counter-arguments for me to read. Just let her build the entire rhetorical edifice, because every stone she throws at me, she is ultimately throwing at her own glass house. She simply hasn't realized it yet." His former communications director, interviewed half a decade later in the film, offered a candid admission of her own misjudgment. "I was absolutely convinced he was making a catastrophic strategic error. I genuinely believed we needed to aggressively push back. In real time, I wanted rapid response talking points ready to deploy regarding the campaign funding, the social media history, the shifting political alliances, everything she was guaranteed to weaponize against him." He flatly refused. He said, "No. We are going to allow her to make her argument completely unimpeded, and then we are going to politely ask her 4 questions. She shook her head in lingering disbelief. I thought his strategy was political suicide. I have never been more profoundly incorrect about anything in my entire professional life. Conversely, the documentary painted a starkly different picture of the representative's preparation environment. It highlighted the supreme overconfidence, the endless repetition of rehearsed attack lines, and the absolute certainty permeating her team that they were on the precipice of delivering a fatal career-ending blow to a major political rival. Former members of her strategic staff, speaking under the strict condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere in the days leading up to the event. She was flawlessly prepared for an ideological brawl. One strategist recalled grimly, she had perfectly memorized every single vulnerability in his public profile. The financial backing, the deleted digital history, the missed legislative votes she had weaponized, all of it. The offensive strategy was a masterpiece. What she completely failed to prepare for another former aide, noted quietly, was an adversary who would simply agree with her entire premise. Someone who would accept every single hostile characterization, completely place it on the Intel 2022 official public record, and then calmly ask her to justify her own actions. While refusing to break eye contact, there is no public relations strategy capable of countering that maneuver. Because when your opponent completely absorbs your attack and politely asks you a direct question in return, the only viable political move left on the board is to answer the question, and she either couldn't answer it or she stubbornly refused to. To this day, I am honestly not sure which it was. The filmmakers dedicated an entire gripping segment of the documentary to analyzing the specific psychological breakdown that resulted in the two words that permanently altered her trajectory. They interviewed esteemed linguists, behavioral psychologists, and veteran campaign consultants, individuals who had dedicated their entire careers to studying how human language degrades under the immense pressure of public scrutiny. The overwhelming consensus among the experts was not that the phrase was inherently malicious or intentionally bigoted. Rather, the consensus was that it represented a catastrophic failure of discipline. It was the absolute loss of control. It was the singular devastating moment where 7 years of meticulously manufactured public presentation shattered, revealing a flash of raw, unmanaged, and deeply authentic emotional exhaustion on a live global broadcast. In the realm of modern politics, one veteran analyst explained to the camera, the performance is the entire job. What she inadvertently revealed to the world in that terrifying split second wasn't necessarily her true political ideology or even her genuine anger toward the vice president. It was the crushing, agonizing weight of having to perform a flawless, untouchable persona for 7 consecutive years. And when the pressure finally caused that facade to crack open, when "you people" slipped out into the microphone, what the American electorate truly witnessed was the realization that maintaining that artificial performance had been quietly destroying her from the inside out. And the ultimate bill for that performance had finally come due. Near the conclusion of the film, the director asked the vice president if he had ever anticipated that the hearing would end in such a spectacularly destructive fashion. He sat quietly for a long contemplative moment before answering. "No," he stated softly. "I fully expected her to eventually answer at least one of the 4 questions. Just one. That is truly all it would have taken to diffuse the tension. If she had simply provided a direct answer to even the most 12 uses 17 side, rudimentary question, even just confirming the reality of her own social media post, the entire dynamic of the morning would have shifted. I would have offered a rebuttal. She would have offered a counter-rebuttal. And it would have simply been another standard, forgettable partisan hearing on Capitol Hill." He shook his head, with a measure of solemnity. I never for a moment expected her to completely refuse to answer all of them. I have navigated countless high-pressure environments throughout my career. I have observed many powerful individuals under extreme duress. What I have consistently found is that the specific question a person fiercely refuses to answer is always infinitely more revealing than the question they enthusiastically address. She responded to every single factual inquiry I made with a frantic pivot to a completely unrelated topic. And that final fateful phrase was simply the tragic consequence of a politician who had finally run out of alternative topics to pivot toward. The filmmaker gently pressed him, asking if he harbored any lingering sympathy for the immense political damage she had subsequently endured. He considered the question deeply. I believe she is a genuinely talented individual, he finally offered. I believe she originally arrived in the nation's capital, possessing authentic, deeply held convictions. And I believe that, somewhere along the chaotic journey, maintaining the lucrative public performance became vastly more important to her operation than executing the actual convictions. It is a tragedy that befalls many well-intentioned individuals in this city on both sides of the partisan divide. I certainly do not claim to be entirely immune to those exact same temptations myself. He paused, his expression hardening ever so slightly. However, she utilized a global platform to aggressively attack the character of my family. She utilized national television to label my entire existence a deliberate fraud, simply for her own financial and political aggrandizement. She executed that attack, believing she was entirely insulated from any professional consequences. He locked eyes with the camera lens. I asked her 4 strictly fact-based questions, relying entirely on public documents and verifiable history. That is not a partisan political assassination. That is the fundamental mechanism of democratic accountability and genuine accountability. Not the performative, rhetorical kind is fundamentally supposed to be an uncomfortable experience. The documentary gracefully concluded its narrative precisely where the chaotic hearing had ended 5 years prior. The footage showed the Grand Commerce Committee chamber slowly emptying out the brilliant broadcast, lighting rigs being powered down and the heavy leather chairs pushed back at chaotic angles by reporters rushing to file their initial dispatches. The camera lens lingered on the completely empty wooden witness chair for a long, haunting moment. Finally, a stark white title card materialized against the black screen. 4 questions were formally presented to the witness. None were ever answered. The congressional record remains unchanged. J.D. Vance continued to serve his term as Vice President of the United States. That specific 18-minute encounter became a permanent defining chapter of his political legacy, the definitive moment he had absorbed a devastating partisan onslaught without a flinch, and systematically dismantled an opponent using nothing more than patience and 4 unanswerable questions. His national approval ratings experienced a significant sustained surge following the broadcast. The strategic concept of allowing the opposition to exhaust their rhetoric, then simply asking 4 questions became a bex of vices to unseven. Foundational lesson taught in elite campaign management seminars for years to come. Representative Ilhan Omar did not vanish from the national stage. She fiercely maintained her seat in the House. She remained a highly vocal, highly visible presence in the media landscape. She remained the complex, deeply polarizing figure she had always been, the barrier-breaking immigrant who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the American political establishment, a woman who had survived more openly hostile environments than most veteran politicians experience in a lifetime. But a fundamental invisible shift had occurred within the delicate political mathematics of her home district. That catastrophic 22-point drop in voter trust never fully regenerated. It did not permanently damage her, standing because of the vice president's specific, conservative ideology. It did not linger because of the theatrical environment of the Senate hearing itself. It lingered because four remarkably simple questions had been clearly articulated on live television in front of 14 million citizens, and the requested answers had simply never materialized. Unanswered questions do not simply evaporate into the ether because a politician refuses to acknowledge them. They slowly accumulate. They fester silently within the internal crosstabs of local polling data, within the hushed debates of regional editorial boards, and within the private, encrypted digital forums of once loyal constituent groups. They echo in the quiet coffee shop conversations between exhausted volunteers who used to proudly canvass neighborhoods together. They hide beneath the timelines of Vance's relation, meticulously neutral, non-committal statements offered by ambitious local politicians. When the press inquires about primary challenges, they wait patiently in the shadows, slowly eroding the foundation of trust, waiting for the 12-12 of Amma, inevitability of the next election cycle. On a brisk, clear Tuesday morning, early the following spring, an elderly immigrant woman slowly boarded a city transit bus on Nicollet Avenue in the heart of Minneapolis. She was beginning her long commute to work following the exact same transit route she had faithfully ridden for over a decade. Displayed prominently on the wall of her modest kitchen at home, there hung a framed photograph she had carefully mounted in the winter of 2019. It was a beautiful image of the proper table, representative on the day of her historic congressional inauguration, standing proudly outside the steps of the United States Capitol, radiating the brilliant smile of someone who has miraculously arrived at a destination the world had deemed impossible to reach. The elderly woman had wept openly on the day she hung that photograph. They were tears of profound joy. The specific, overwhelming kind of joy that washes over you when a barrier you deeply believed was permanently impenetrable suddenly shatters before your eyes. That framed photograph still occupied its place of honor on her kitchen wall. However, in the long, quiet months following the disastrous Senate hearing, she had found herself staring at the image with a fundamentally different perspective. She did not look upon it with diminished cultural pride. That deep-seated pride was permanent, running far too deep within her soul to be erased by the chaotic theater of a single congressional dispute. But she now viewed the image through the lens of a quiet, persistent question that she could not fully articulate. Her unease was not rooted in the controversial phrase, "You people." She, like many others in her community, had ultimately decided to extend grace, concluding that the phrase was likely an exhausted misstatement, rather than a declaration of contempt. Her lingering unease was entirely rooted in the evasion of the four questions. She had watched the dramatic confrontation unfold on the small screen of her mobile phone while sitting alone in the employee break room during her abbreviated lunch hour. She had watched the vice president calmly ask the identical question 4 consecutive times. She had watched the representative aggressively pivot away from it 4 consecutive times. And sitting there alone, while her lunch slowly grew cold, she had found herself quietly wondering, why couldn't she just give him an answer? She still did not possess a satisfactory answer to her own question. She was actively pondering it as the heavy bus rumbled through the awakening streets of Minneapolis. Bathed in the soft morning light, they rolled past the placid, working-class neighborhoods she had called home for 2 decades past. The bustling community center, where her eldest daughter had successfully mastered the English language, and past the local mosque, where she faithfully attended Friday prayers. She was still quietly turning the mystery over in her mind when the bus finally hissed to a halt at her designated stop, the doors swinging open to welcome the morning air. The proud photograph remained securely fastened to her kitchen wall, but the heavy, uncomfortable question remained securely fastened in her mind. The ultimate historical lesson to be extracted from that morning in the Senate chamber, if indeed a singular lesson could be defined, was not strictly about the intricacies of immigration policy, nor was it truly about the individual character of either politician involved. It was about a much simpler, far more durable truth regarding the nature of public life. A skilled public figure can survive almost any form of external partisan attack. The representative had proven that reality more decisively than almost any other figure in modern American political history. She had endured credible threats to her personal safety, humiliating removals from prestigious committee assignments, and the terrifying spectacle of thousands of citizens chanting for her removal at presidential rallies. She had survived the entirety of that crucible and continued to advance her career. Partisan attacks launched from the outside are fundamentally survivable. They can be cleverly leveraged for fundraising. They can be spun by sympathetic media allies, and they can ultimately be outlasted by sheer force of will. What is infinitely more difficult for any public figure to survive is a simple, factual question. Not a malicious attack masquerading as a question. Not a clever rhetorical trap. A genuine, straightforward question asked with perfect clarity on the permanent historical record in front of millions of witnesses. Was your financial statement accurate? What do you offer your donors that your legislative record fails to reflect? What would you say to the family of the victim? Is your terminology a moral principle or merely a political tool? 4. Questions asked 4 times each, 14 million citizens watching intently, and absolutely no answer was provided. In the crushing void created by that absence of an answer, in the empty hollow space, where accountability and transparency should have resided, something permanent and damaging took root. It was not a formal legal verdict handed down by a judge. It was not an official censure ruling delivered by a congressional ethics committee. It was simply the profound, crushing weight of an unanswered question held simultaneously in the minds of 14 million people, each of them quietly drawing their own devastating conclusions in the privacy of their own living rooms, their own kitchens, and their own break rooms across the nation. The ultimate truth does not always arrive accompanied by the loud fanfare of a political victory. Sometimes the truth arrives in the form of absolute silence. Sometimes it arrives in the form of 2 reckless words muttered under the intense pressure of a live television broadcast. Words that can never be retracted, can never be adequately explained away by consultants, and can never be successfully fundraised out of existence. And sometimes the truth simply arrives in the form of an elderly, hard-working woman riding a morning bus through the city she deeply loves. Staring thoughtfully out the window, holding on to a profound question she cannot resolve, quietly re-evaluating the meaning of a photograph hanging on her kitchen wall. The vice president had not needed to destroy the representative's career that morning. He had simply asked her 4 factual questions. She had responded with 2 defensive words that fundamentally failed to provide an answer. And the sheer weight of that silence in the end had taken care of. The rest all on its own.